Houthi defy the international community in Hodeidah and UN offers to ease discussions. Looking back at Stockholm Agreement, is it a truce of peace or monitoring of war? The 7-year war destroyed lives of millions of Yemeni children nationwide. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Shaz Abdelbay. Starting from Hodeidah, where government sources said about 700 families were displaced to the city of Al-Khoukha, while 184 families were displaced to the Mekhe area in Taz. On the other hand, UN mission from Hodeidah offered to hold discussions between the parties of the Hodeidah Agreement. The mission expressed its readiness to ease discussions within the framework of the Stockholm Agreement, noting that the removal of the joint forces from the city is a major shift. United Nations mission further urged all parties to support their obligations to protect civilians in Hodeidah. The joint forces inflicted losses in lives and equipment on the Houthi militia in Hais, south of Hodeidah. The military media of the joint forces reported that the killing of 20 Houthi militants in the strikes that came after the rebel targeted civilian areas. The military media added all Houthi movements are carefully watched, stressing that Houthi movements outside Stockholm Agreement areas will not be achieved. Chief of Staff Saghir bin Hammoud met in the Saudi capital Riyadh with the commander of the joint forces. The meeting discussed the military situation and the battle operations against the Houthi militia. It also reviewed the general situations and various field details in the country. Almost 3 years now since the Stockholm Agreement was approved under the umbrella of the United Nations, yet Houthis have started violating it since day one. More on the story is within this report.
On December 2018, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres attended the conclusion of the Stockholm Agreement. The agreement was comprised of 3 subsidiary arrangements: the Hodeidah Agreement, the Prisoners' Deal, and the half-page Taz Understanding. The Hodeidah Agreement, which was backed by the UN Security Council Resolutions 2451 2018 and 2452 2019, contained several issues with a 3-week timeline, including an immediate ceasefire, redeployment, not withdrawal of forces, the formation of a UN-led redeployment coordination committee, removal of fortifications and halt of military reinforcements, demining of Hodeidah port, not the city, a strengthened UN presence, and security and economic measures. The agreement resulted from external pressure, and the process was rushed that parties did not sign it. The Stockholm Agreement set an ambitious, if not impossible, timeline for the redeployment. The bigger problem was, however, that it required the ports to be handed over to local Yemeni forces in accordance with the Yemeni law. The government and the Houthi rebels interpreted this clause profoundly differently. For the government, local security forces meant the pre-war security structure, while the Houthis rebel understood local security forces as their own personnel. In reality, the pre-war security system in Hodeidah is hardly existent anymore, given the Houthis rebels' deep penetration into the security system as well as the establishment of their own supervisory system. Hodeidah is a prime example of rebel governance in the making. The text of the Stockholm Agreement required the UNHA to monitor the implementation of the agreement, which was subject to competing interpretations by the conflict parties. Lastly, political commitment to implement the Hodeidah ceasefire was notably weak, if not entirely absent. The Houthi rebels fired at the mission and tried to repress their work in every way. Violations occurred on a daily basis. In the end, and after 3 years of this deal, one might call this the monitoring of a war rather than of a ceasefire.
Hodeidah is an important city. It's the most important city in Yemen. The city gains more importance due to its geopolitical position, being near to Bab el-Mandeb in the Red Sea. More on the story is within this report.
Hodeidah is a seaport located on the Red Sea to the west of Yemen. The city is the sole gate from which all necessary supplies are channeled into Yemen. Hodeidah's port assures the most basic and humanitarian needs of the country. It, however, provides the rebels with military supplies with which they keep the bloodshedding in Yemen continues. Experts look at Hodeidah port too as a hidden window for smuggling Iranian weapons to Houthis. They also consider the port as a launching pad for Houthi rockets and drones. As to them, Hodeidah port is also believed to be used by Houthis to train their militias. The rebels use the port of Hodeidah as a base from which their explosive boats are run into the Red Sea. These boats are steered in suicidal attacks to disrupt navigation or to gain tactical privileges for the Houthis. These facts make Houthis' control over Hodeidah a real test to the international community, not because of the humanitarian obligation toward the Yemeni people, but because of the military and political obligation as well. Controlling the port city means humanitarian assistance to more than 20 million Yemenis are at stake. The humanitarian aid that should be delivered to the agonized children are instead siphoned through underground channels, according to experts. International community must take an action to stop Houthi control over the city and its port. This control will be an interference in the Red Sea and a stumbling block to the global marine transport. In this event, the humanitarian, military, political and economic consequences of the Houthi control on Hodeidah will have other severe international costs, unless the world moves to save the last gate for humanitarian aid to millions in Yemen.
The coalition announced it had carried out 11 operations in the western coast, including the operations targeting 26 Houthi positions in Ma'rib and Al-Baida within the past 24 hours. The coalition said 140 Houthi militants have been killed and 18 military vehicles destroyed in these operations. The statement stressed the support for operations on the western coast outside the areas of the Stockholm Agreement. The coalition announced the destruction of a marine mine planted by the Houthi militia south of the Red Sea in Hodeidah. The statement added that the total of 207 marine mines have been removed and destroyed on the coasts of the southern Red Sea. Reports indicate that the Houthi militia had planted hundreds of marine mines in the international waters of the Red Sea, targeting sea traffic through Bab el-Mandeb. The explosion of some of those mines resulted in the killing of fishermen. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation condemned the Houthi militia's threat to international navigation in the Red Sea. In a statement, the organization expressed condemnation of the Houthis' continuous attempts to threaten global navigation in the southern side of Red Sea by planting hundreds of sea mines. The war in Yemen has affected all aspects of life in the country. Vulnerable children are those who are hit most due to the conflict. They suffer from malnutrition, illness, to no schooling. More on the story is within this report.
Yemen is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, with around 21 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. including more than 11 million children. Since the conflict escalated in March 2015, the country has become a living hell for the children. At least 10,000 children have been killed or maimed since the beginning of the conflict, and thousands more have been recruited into the fighting. An estimated 1.7 million children are internally displaced. The damage and closure of schools and hospitals has also disrupted access to education and health services. More than 2 million children are out of school. Meanwhile, Yemen has been plagued by one of the world's worst food crises, with nearly 2.3 million children under the age of 5 projected to suffer from acute malnutrition in 2021. Of these, 400,000 are expected to suffer from severe acute malnutrition and could die if they do not receive urgent treatment. Every 10 minutes, a child dies from preventable diseases like cholera and measles. That's according to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
Childhood in Yemen is a special kind of hell. Yemeni children are starving. This year, nearly half of all children under 5 in Yemen are said to suffer from acute malnutrition. 400,000 of those children face severe acute malnutrition and could die without urgent treatment. Starving children are even more vulnerable to preventable diseases like cholera, diphtheria, and measles. Every 10 minutes, a child dies a needless death from diseases like those ones in Yemen. This war is swallowing a whole generation of Yemenis. It has to stop.
In addition, around 8.5 million children do not have access to safe water, sanitation, or hygiene, a dangerous combination of factors driven by conflict and economic decline, and now exacerbated by COVID-19, have compounded the dire situation for Yemen's youngest children. The war in Yemen continues, marking just one more way that Yemeni children are paying with their lives in a crisis they have no part in creating. For every child killed by bombs and bullets, dozens of children are starving to death. Boys and girls are the future of Yemen. Parties to conflict must protect them from use and abuse and start treating children as the precious asset they are. Peace is the only solution, and child survivors need full support to heal and rebuild their lives.
The parliamentary group of the General People's Congress grieved the death of Sheikh Yasser Al-Awadi, who was the Assistant Secretary General of the GPC. The group said that the late Sheikh Yasser Al-Awadi had a long political and parliamentary career. Worth mentioning, Sheikh Yasser Al-Awadi died today in the Egyptian capital, Cairo. Coming next, Houthi rebels continue their war against free press and journalists.
اضطرينا نحن نغادر من ذي ونزحنا.
الله يستنقلكم يا محويتني. الله يستنقل.
Welcome back. Journalists in Yemen, especially in the Houthi-controlled areas, pay the highest costs in the time of war. Houthi rebels commit human rights violations against them on a daily basis. More on the story is within this report.
The Houthi militia continues its violations against media professionals and journalists. Abducted journalists have been subjected to brutal torture, forced disappearance, and death. In objection of the Houthi violations and abuses, a group of mothers, sisters, wives, and other female family members formed an association called the Abductees Mothers Association and came together to demand that their relatives must be released. The group has made it their mission to grant the victims of arbitrary detention their rights and freedom. The Abductees Mothers Association aimed to work in an attempt to end the suffering of their abducted, forcibly disappeared, and arbitrarily arrested sons. They have been proactive in monitoring the violations against them in order to compensate them and to bring the perpetrators to justice. The group works closely with regional and international organizations, including the UN Envoy Office in Yemen and the Red Cross, playing an influential role in negotiations between both sides. The association supports the families of abductees, follows up on cases, and facilitates rehabilitation of the prisoners upon their release. Since the Stockholm deal, the Abductees Mothers Association has continued to mount pressure. Recently, they were successful in releasing 40 detainees who required medical attention and 8 prisoners who were unlawfully charged with death sentences without legal procedures during the war. Recently, they were successful in releasing 40 detainees who required medical attention and 8 prisoners who were unlawfully charged with death sentences without legal procedures during the war. The Abductees Mothers Association condemned all violations against the journalists and their freedom, which include the issued execution judgments, and call to drop those judgments. They demand to grant them their right to practice their occupation and to compensate those affected by violators. The women involved go to extraordinary lengths to find and release their kidnapped relatives, often in the face of threats and intimidation. They draw on social and cultural traditions and use their position as Yemeni women to mediate and provide humanitarian assistance in ways that men in their society can't. Ultimately, their strength lies in their ability to humanize a highly political issue. Yemenis have been deprived from living a normal, decent life. The Houthis do not only seize their country and properties, but also their freedom of speech and expression.
The Houthi militia stormed the branch of the Yemeni Women's Union in Ib City. The rebels expelled all female employees of the union and issued a decision to form a Houthi committee affiliated to them to run the union. Sources pointed out that the Houthis are trying to Houthinize all unions, civil societies, and women's organizations. Houthi rebels threatened to sack 30 employees in Al Thawra hospital in Sana'a. Sources said these vulnerable employees have been warned to be dismissed off their jobs if they keep demanding to have their unpaid salaries. The sources indicated that the employees have not been paid for 5 years. Employees are facing hard challenges every day. They have been with no regular pay for more than 5 years now. This has caused severe consequences on their lives. More on the story is within this report.
Since the fall of the capital Sana'a under the control of the Houthi militia, they have immediately replaced its followers in government jobs and positions without the majority of them having any qualifications. As part of the expansion of the purge operations of employees to include all kinds of jobs and positions, while those close to the leader of the Houthi group and belonging to his dynasty hold most of the senior positions. A source at the Ministry of Education in Sana'a confirmed that the Houthi militia is replacing its original employees and confiscating their job numbers. He said that they request specific daily working hours, and if any employee is absent for any circumstances, he is directly replaced by Houthi elements. Replacement of jobs was not limited to males only, but the militia formed a committee of Zainabiyat whose task is to monitor working hours in government facilities and to replace any female employee with another who follows them. Houthi militia is carrying out a quick process of replacing employees by confiscating the job, hiding documents from the Ministry of Civil Service, and granting the job number to elements they follow. The Houthi militia had controlled members of the judiciary and excluded employees who were not affiliated with the militia to be able to fully control the judicial system, which is responsible for issuing judgments and determining the fate of justice. Houthis' approach was not limited to the government of state agencies, but rather replaced the legitimate secretaries with loyalists, forcing them to give up their positions and hand over the citizens' documents in their possession. They have carried out a process of exclusion against academics in a number of Yemeni universities under their control, where it dismissed 30 university professors from various faculties of Damar University under false pretexts and appointed others loyal to it who do not hold academic qualifications. Also, it replaced teachers in many large and important schools in the capital Sana'a and the areas under its control, where the educational sector has witnessed many changes in the curricula to serve Houthi projects. The campaign of exclusion and marginalization practiced by the Houthi militia against many of those who do not belong to it continues, as decisions are issued in favor to its members in various government sectors in the capital Sana'a and the governors under its control, at a time when it continues to confiscate employees' salaries for years, spend it in its wars, and enrich its supervisors and senior leaders. When can all these violations and corruption end? No one knows.
Here's a reminder of the main headlines. Houthi defy the international community in Hodeidah and UN offers to ease discussions. Looking back at Stockholm Agreement, is it a truce of peace or monitoring of war? The 7-year war destroys lives of millions of Yemeni children nationwide. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching.